Good morning once again. Good to see everybody here. We'll be in Acts chapter 17 and verse 16 in a moment. But before we get into those verses, I'd first like to read Romans chapter 1 and verse 18, starting in verse 18. It says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations. Their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, and of birds, and of four-footed animals, and crawling things. Therefore God gave them over to the lust of their hearts, to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. For they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen." What the Apostle Paul teaches there in reality about the truth of the downward spiral of mankind was true to the society that he was teaching to. And we're going to find this morning in Acts chapter 17, the Apostle Paul going to a place perhaps you've heard of before, to Athens, the epicenter of religion, philosophy, and art, there in the Greco-Roman world. And there they too had fallen into this trap that Paul talks about in Romans chapter 1. They had gotten to the point to where they began to worship the creature rather than the Creator, exchanged the truth for a lie, and had allowed themselves to drift away from the God that they had once known. And we're going to find them now being taught once again who this God is that they had forgotten. And so the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 1 doesn't just complain about it or he's not just venting. He does something about it. And we'll see that here in Acts chapter 17. He's going to speak against that type of experience by the world around him, the society around him. So in Acts chapter 17, we're going to see the Apostle Paul there in Athens. Now, if you remember last week, we read that the Apostle Paul had to leave Berea because of some persecution. The Jews from Thessalonica had come to Berea and began to put the heat on Paul once again. So the Apostle Paul has to leave. But as was typical, Timothy remained. And Silas remained also as well in Berea. But Paul went ahead and headed off towards Athens. And so that's where we find him now. He's going to be in Athens, kind of waiting for Timothy and Silas to catch up with him there. So that's where the story continues. This, again, is Acts chapter 17 and verse 16. "Now when Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was being provoked within him as he was observing the city full of idols." And certainly Athens was a city full of idols. In Roman satire, it was said that when you go to Athens, you're more likely to find a god than a man. It's like as though there were more gods in Athens than there were actually men. Of course, I'm sure that was a hyperbole, but still that was kind of what Athens was known for. It had so many different gods. And of course, it's, again, this epicenter of religion and philosophy and things. And it's embedded in this Greco-Roman society. And this society that Paul is speaking to and that Athens is kind of the center of was a society that had a god for everything. There was a god for love. There was a god for poetry. There was even a god for beekeeping, which was interesting. They had a god for everything. Any aspect of their life, they had a god for that. And so Paul goes to Athens, where you can just imagine the dozens, if not hundreds, of idols that he's encountering. And as he's there in Athens waiting for Timothy and Silas, he's looking around and he's seeing these idols, and his spirit is provoked. And I think this had to do a lot with the fact that Paul had not been desensitized to all the gods that were there, like perhaps maybe the Jews who had grown up there. When you encounter something like that firsthand, and you come from the outside coming in and you see it, it's a lot more evident to you than if you grow up in it. Such is our society. I think perhaps, because most of us, if not all of us here, have grown up in American society with American values, with the worldview that we've been handed. We grew up in this society, and we perhaps don't really understand, how far off we've gotten from the true God and serving the true God, and having those Christian values. Someone from the outside who's coming in would probably see a great stark contrast between the two. But Paul here is provoked in spirit, and I wonder, are we the type that kind of just go with the flow? We see our society, we see people who are far from God, we see people who are perhaps serving other things. It may not be idols made of stone, but it could be money, popularity, power, pleasure, approval from others. It could be a lot of other different gods that may not stand as a statue, but might stand as an idea in their minds. And are we provoked in spirit as we see that, as we engage with the people that we come into contact with? Hopefully so. But the Apostle Paul wasn't just provoked within him. There are a lot of Christians who are very much discouraged. They are troubled by what they see in the society today as they turn on the television, as they get on social media, as they listen to radio, podcasts, whatever else. They become very concerned about society and where it is going, as the Apostle Paul did. But notice what the Apostle Paul did. He wasn't just provoked in his spirit. He wasn't just troubled by what he saw. He got busy and did something about it. Look what he does in verse 17. So, because he was provoked, he was reasoning in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be present. You see Paul expanding a little bit. Remember in Acts chapter 17, in verse 2, we said his custom was to just go to the synagogues and teach. Not to say that he didn't go other places, but here it specifically says he went to the synagogues with the Jews. He was also speaking to the God-fearing people. Those are the Gentiles who feared the God of the Bible, but were not full-fledged Jewish proselytes to the Jewish faith. But then also in the marketplace, anyone he could talk to. So he was talking to all different flavors of people religiously there as he was in Athens. So he was provoked within him, but that motivated him to action. And it's interesting, not that just that he was motivated to action, but the type of action that he took. Paul realized that the answer that this society needed was Jesus. The society needed the true God. And he went teaching people about Jesus. He didn't go to the governing officials and try to get the laws changed and try to enact things from the top up and try to trickle that down to force everybody else into his way of thinking and into a Christian worldview and trying to force people through law. He did it from the ground roots up and just telling people about Jesus, going to people at the synagogue, going to people out in the streets and just telling people about Jesus. The best thing we can do if we are provoked in our spirit when we look at the society around us is tell people about Jesus. Jesus is the answer. God is the one who can transform not only an individual, but also transform a society. Now, am I saying that we should not have godly and just laws? Absolutely, we should. We should try to get people into office who will, enact these laws that are just and good and right and consistent with morality and consistent with all those things. I'm not saying we don't do that. I'm just saying we should not rely upon that to turn our country into a Christian society. Our country will turn back to Christ again when we start telling people about Christ again, and when we start converting people to Christ. And as individuals within the society turn to Christ, then things will begin to transform in our society. So if you have issues with our society today, the best thing you can start doing today, start telling people about Jesus. Lead as many people as you possibly can into faith with Jesus Christ. And in doing so, we'll transform this society one individual at a time. And we'll see great change. So the Apostle Paul was provoked, but he also took action, and he also went and tried to convert people to Christ in doing so. And then in verse 18 it says, and also some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers were conversing with him. All right, so the Epicurean and Stoic, you couldn't get really more of a contrast of ideas and of worldviews than the Stoics and the Epicureans. The Epicureans were, they viewed the gods as more distant. Okay, they believed that the gods, yes, there were gods, but that they were all somewhere far, far away, just enjoying, having a great party, enjoying pleasures and things like that, and weren't really concerned with what was going on in human society and in the world in general. And so the Epicureans would teach that the best thing an individual could do then is imitate those gods. Try to separate yourself from the world and just enjoy life. Indulge in pleasure and indulge in anything that brings you pleasure, anything that's to your liking. And they didn't really have a really strong moral convictions. It was more like anything that felt good was good, anything that felt bad was bad. And as a matter of fact, there was a kind of change in terminology where they wouldn't say that something was good, they would say, I like it. So if you liked it, it was good. If you didn't like it, it wasn't good. So that was the Epicurean worldview. The gods are far in distance. They're not really paying attention to what's going on in the world. They're just enjoying pleasure, and we should follow that as well and enjoy life as they do. And try to avoid pain as much as possible and try to invite pleasure as much as possible. The Stoics, of course, were on the other side. The Stoics were more like, they were more pantheists. They believed in the fact that God was in everything, literally in everything. Not that he's the one that created all things and yet brought all creation into existence, but separate from creation, but that he actually endued all of creation and was one with creation. And their view was that history kind of just goes through cycles. So usually human history would go through, and at the height of it would have this cataclysmic experience where everything would crash and burn, and then everything would be purified, start over again, and things just went in cycles. There was no beginning and end, it was just cycles. And so they believed that the best thing that a person could do was to live a life of discipline and self-control, to get in line with this God that endued everything, and to live a very strict type of life. So you can see how different the Epicureans are with the Stoics. The Epicureans believe the gods are far away. The Stoics believe God is in everything. The Epicureans believe pleasure and self-satisfaction is what life was all about. The Stoics were all about no discipline, stringent morals, and things like that. And so as Paul is conversing with these two different groups of people, of course, you can imagine what type of conversations that he's having. And you can even imagine why they said what they said about Paul. It says, some were saying, as you continue there in verse 18, it says, some were saying, what would this idle babbler wish to say? Others, he seems to be a proclaimer of strange deities because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. They called him an idle babbler. And literally that word means someone whose profession is in picking up scraps. So it's like a person who just walked around picking up scraps. That was their meal, I guess. Paul was kind of seen as a person who just kind of picked up the scraps of different thoughts and ideas and philosophies and was putting it all together to then produce this new religion that he was proclaiming, at least new to them. And you can kind of surmise why they would see that, right? Because the biblical view that we have, the God that we serve, kind of has a little bit of both the Stoic and the Epicurean. In the sense that we have a God that's transcendent of creation, a God who is above all creation. We'll talk about that more in a moment. But we also have a God who's very close and intimate with his creation and very immanent within his creation. We also have a God who gives us all things to enjoy, we're told in 1 Timothy chapter 6. He wants us to enjoy the blessings that he's given us. He wants us to experience pleasure. He wants us to experience life in its fullness in the sense of enjoying all the blessings that he provides, but he also puts restraint on those pleasures as well. You know, you can have sexual pleasure, but you're restrained within the marriage covenant. You can enjoy food and drink and things like that, but you got to do it with limitations. You got to do it with self-control. So this God that Paul was proclaiming had a little bit of stoicism, a little bit of Epicureanism. Not that he believed either one of those viewpoints, but you can see where they would say he's kind of teaching a little bit of everything. And he's just picking up the scraps of different philosophies and ideas. So they cast this accusation against him in verse 19, and they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, may we know what this new teaching is which you are proclaiming, for you are bringing some strange things to our ears. So we want to know what these things mean. All right, so he's brought to the Areopagus, the hill of I can't say the god of war. What's his name? Ares. Okay, thank you, Eden. She knows all about the Greek gods and stuff. The hill of Ares, who was the god of war. Okay, that's where you get the Areopagus, the hill of Ares, the god of war. It's also called Mars Hill as well. But anyways, this is where he's going. They have this council where they're going to kind of challenge Paul in what he is teaching and wanting to figure out more of what he's going to say. And they say, you're bringing strange things to our ears. Now in verse 21 it says, now all the Athenians and the strangers visiting there used to spend their time in nothing other than telling or hearing something new. All right, so the Athenians and strangers who were visiting, they just enjoyed hearing something new. They were fascinated by anything that you could bring in, and that type of attitude has both a good side to it and a bad side to it. It's good to be open to hear new things, right? You grow when you hear new things. You expand when you're challenged by new ideas, and you kind of wrestle with them and you think about them and you flesh them out. There's a sense in which valuing new things is good, but there's also it's also dangerous as well. And I think our society is kind of infatuated with what's new. And this seems to be typical of any really advanced civilization. You get to the point where you got the technology, you got a society that's well established, and people then begin to have free time. Maybe they're not working as long as they used to. They're not having to go from sun up and sundown to harvesting, things on the farm. They're not having to work, this extreme amount of time. Now, that's not true of everyone in America. I know that's not true of everyone, but you get to a point where you get into society where you have more idle time. And when you have more idle time, what do you want to do? You want to stimulate yourself by finding the next new thing. You want to buy you want to find out what the new fashion is. So you go out and buy clothes to have the new fashion, or you want to figure out what the new rave is, or the new, you want to jump on the bandwagon and what's the new type of my brain's not working today, of philosophy or religion or even politics. I don't know why I couldn't think of that word, politics. You're just not really, you're always looking for something new. And I think that's true of our society, especially now that we have social media, now that we have YouTube and we have Facebook and we have a lot of people who are given a platform to where we're constantly looking for someone to teach us something new that we haven't heard before. And only something is valuable if it's novel. If it's brand new, if it's a new idea, we want to hold on to that. And anything that seems to be ancient or old or tried and true, as I would think, seems to be discarded and looked down upon. If it's not new, then it's not good. And that can be dangerous. That type of attitude can be very dangerous. Because we forget that there's a reason why certain things are old. There's a reason why things have have carried on generation after generation truths and ideas and philosophies that have endured the test of time, it's because they have some weight to them. It means it's because a lot of times they are in line with truth and reality. But in a society that's always looking for something new, oftentimes we miss out on what we've already found and not in valuing that. So anyways, they were interested in hearing things that were new. So they had Paul stand before them and to give an explanation of the things that he had been teaching. So then we get to the actual sermon in verse 22 down. And as we go through this sermon, we're going to see that the Apostle Paul is focusing a lot on God in this particular sermon. As a matter of fact, we're going to find some 9 aspects of God in this one short sermon that he gives. And there's no reason, or there's no wonder why he's spending so much time on God, because he's addressing an unknown God that they had worshipped. So let's just start it in verse 22. It says, "So Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, 'Men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious in all aspects. For while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. Therefore what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you.'" All right, so Paul's being very, very cordial to the council. Hey, I see that you guys are religious. I like the way he starts that off. He's not putting them on the defensive. He's not lambasting them. He just says, "Hey, I know you guys are religious. I see all the idols that you have in your town. Clearly, you're religious people, but you have this one that's inscribed to the unknown God." Now, the reason they had this God was because they had an idol for all different gods, and they wanted to put that one in just in case they'd missed the God, just in case they'd overlooked one of the gods. So they had this one idol that was to the unknown God. And that's where Paul says, this is where I want to camp out with you guys. This is where I want to talk to you a little bit. And I want to explain to you about this unknown God. And this is a very good technique that he uses. He finds some commonality with them. He finds something within their own belief system that he can kind of bring out and bring to light. And then he can kind of both correct, but at the same time bring more information to. A very good technique that we could use in sharing the gospel: find some common ground with people and then expand on that common ground to share with them the totality of truth that you want to share with them. He says, "Therefore what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands." Verse 24. So there's a lot about God just in that verse. First off, he says, the God who made the world. The God that Paul was proclaiming was a God who made the world. Now this is contrasted then with the gods that they served. In ancient literature, when it came to religious texts and things, you find that they weren't really focused on how things came into being. They didn't have a verse necessarily, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." Usually those texts begin with an already created world. They might talk about man being formed from what was already pre-existing, but there wasn't really a whole lot of focus on a God that actually created everything. They kind of just naturally assumed that everything has always existed from eternity past. But the Apostle Paul says this unknown God that you are worshiping is a God who made everything. He made the world and all things in it. So he's saying your religion is not full yet. You don't have the full knowledge yet because, one, you're missing this unknown God, but two, you're missing where everything came from. Everything had a beginning, and that there was a God behind everything that exists. And then we see a God with all authority. He says, since he is Lord of heaven and earth. So he's creator of all things, but he also has the highest authority over all things. Which they may not have had too much problems with. They had Zeus and, they had those gods that were high above all the other gods, but not to the extent of this, where he's Lord of heaven and earth, really having all authority above all gods that they might try to perceive or try to come up with. but also over all things that exist. But then he's also one that cannot be contained. He says, does not dwell in temples made with hands. Which a Bible student might see that and say, wait a minute, Paul. Didn't God dwell in temples made with hands? As a matter of fact, Solomon's temple was made with hands. They made it in the stone, a lot of it in the stone quarry, shaped all the stones and then brought it into the place where the temple was, and said they didn't even hear a tool because everything just fit together so perfectly. But it was made by human hands, and yet we're told that that was going to be God's dwelling place. Is Paul being disingenuous with this statement? Well, if we go back to when Solomon's temple was actually constructed, we'll see that even Solomon would agree with Paul in what he's saying. In 1 Kings chapter 8, in verse 27, Solomon says, "But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house which I have built?" So Solomon himself recognized the fact that God could not absolutely and completely dwell in that temple in his full manifestation, in his full glory. He realized that God can't dwell in one particular location. He can manifest himself in a particular location. He manifested himself on Mount Sinai. He manifested himself between the cherubim. He can manifest himself. He manifests himself in the church with his presence. He can manifest himself, but nothing can completely contain him in the completeness of his being. And so Solomon recognized that even after he had constructed God a temple. And so what Paul is saying is in line with that. He's saying that he does not dwell in temples made with hands. That is, you can't contain him completely and absolutely in a temple. He says, nor is he served by human hands, continuing in verse 25, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. The gods that they serve, you fed them. If you wanted their favor, you fed them food. You would offer them up an animal sacrifice, or if you were eating food, you would offer up that food to them to get the favor of the gods. And you actually, of course, to get even more basic than that, you actually constructed the idol that was that God. And here he's saying that the true God doesn't need anything from man. And again, this is consistent with the Old Testament in Psalm 50. The psalmist says something similar to this, but from God's standpoint. He says in verse 8, starting in verse 8, Psalm 80, verse 8, "I do not reprove you for your sacrifices, and your burnt offerings are continually before me. I shall take no young bull out of your house, nor male goats out of your folds, for every beast of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know every bird of the mountains, and everything that moves in the field is mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world is mine and all it contains. Shall I eat the flesh of bulls or drink the blood of male goats? Offer to God a sacrifice of thanksgiving and pay your vows to the Most High. Call upon me in the day of trouble, I shall rescue you, and you will honor me." So there, God speaking, saying, I don't need anything from you. You think you're benefiting me somehow by bringing up these sacrifices, but at the end of the day, I don't need them. And even if I was hungry, even if I could experience something similar to hunger, I wouldn't come to you because I have all of creation at my disposal. And that's, again, what Paul is teaching here. He doesn't need anything from mankind. God is all self-sufficient in and of himself. He doesn't need us to do anything for him. Again, all sufficient in and of himself. And then we see him also as the bestower of all life. After saying he doesn't need anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. He's the giver of life as well. You philosophers, you people on this council of Areopagus, he's made you. The reason why you are here today is because he gave you life and breath. But then also, so everything that we talked about so far kind of alludes to God's transcendent nature, right? We see a God who made all things. We see a God who holds all authority. We see a God who is all self-sufficient. We see a God who gives life. This is a transcendent God. This is a God above anything that we can comprehend, but a God who is above all the other, any God that you might try to come up with in your own mind or with your own hands. He's transcendent. Everything that we're going to talk about next talks about the immanence of God. So theologians talk about the transcendence of God and the immanence of God. Our God is a God who is transcendent above everything, as we mentioned already, but he's also a God that's very immanent, a God who's very close at hand, very near to us. It's not that he's transcendent and far away somewhere. He's transcendent, yes, but he's also very near. And that's going to come up as the Apostle Paul continues on. In that, God is a God who seeks a relationship with mankind. It says in verse 26, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation, that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. All right, so this God who's so transcendent that he used all these different descriptions to show just how transcendent he is a God who also seeks relationship. As a matter of fact, he's designed the whole world, but with the times and the locations where people would live and dwell, so that they would grope after him, that they would seek him, so that they would find him. He wants to be found. Knock and the door shall be open to you, Christ said. This is a God who's not hidden in the sense that he doesn't want anyone to come near him, but he opens up his arms to receive all to himself. And he's constructed the world, he's constructed human history in such a way that that would happen. He's a God who desires relationship. But then also he is our Father as well. He says in verse 28, for in him we live and move and exist, as even some of your own poets have said, for we also are his children. Being then the children of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and thought of man. So he's saying here that we are created by God. He's probably quoting there from Aratus, who was from actual Tarsus, which that might sound familiar to you. That's the same city that Paul was from. That's probably why he's quoting this particular poet. But the poet, he quotes from their own poets that says, we are his children. That's interesting. In all of this discussion or this discourse that Paul's giving, he hasn't quoted a single scripture. Now, everything that he's saying is scriptural and biblical, and if you have a Bible with Bible references, you'll see it jam-packed with scriptures. Everything is based in Scripture, but he's not quoting per se Scripture, but he does quote from their own literature and their own writings to show that, hey, you guys already have a glimpse of what I'm talking about. You already kind of have an idea of what I'm talking about. You just need to more fully develop that and understand it better. We are his children. He is our Father. And so he says that doesn't make sense then, if we are his children and he is our Father, that we would create the gods. For one, how does a child create the father? The child would already have to be in existence to create the father, but the father is the father who brings to life the child. So it's illogical to think that the children of God could then create the God that they come from, if that makes sense. But also what he might be alluding to is the fact that why would our Father be made of lesser materials than us? You think about a human being is very complex. We have if you're just looking at the physical systems of our body, very complex and very well constructed. And you can think about the fact that we have logic and reasoning and emotion and things like that. But you have a piece of stone or a piece of metal that can't think, it can't reason, it can't do anything. It's of a lesser, it's on the lower end of the scale of existence. So why would your Father be of a lesser substance than you? Doesn't make sense. If he's your Father, he should at least be greater than you or of the same nature of you, but not less than you. is the point that, possibly the point that Paul is making there. But he is a God, of course, that is our Father. And here he's speaking in the very general sense. There's a sense in which God is Father of everyone. If you go to Luke chapter 3, when he traced back the genealogy from Christ all the way to Adam, he doesn't just stop with Adam, he says the Son of God. And so there's a sense in which all the human race are children of God. Now, that we become more precisely the children of God when we are born again. First John chapter 3 and verse 1, he says, what love the Father has shown us, and that we should be called children of God, such as we. The Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 8 says, for as many as are led by the Spirit are children of God. There's a more exact way in which we can be children of God through Jesus Christ. But in a general sense, in the sense that we all get our life from God, we're all children of God in that regard. In the scriptures, when it talks about us being that type of child of God through Christ, it's talking about us receiving spiritual life from the Father. We have physical life from the Father in a general sense, but we have spiritual life from the Father and are children of God through faith in Jesus Christ. So anyways, he talks about the fact that he is our Father, but then also that he is our judge. In verse 30, therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God is now declaring to men that all people everywhere should repent, because he has fixed the day in which he will judge the world in righteousness through a man whom he has appointed, having furnished proof to all men by raising him from the dead. Now this is, I wouldn't say the most important point that Paul is making, but from a practical standpoint, this is very, very important. Up to this point, the 8 aspects of God that we've already talked about, a person might take or leave, okay? You're sitting there in the council, okay, Paul, you believe in this transcendent God, you believe in this immanent God, who's both high above us, but also close and near to us. All right, well, that was a good story. Thank you, Paul. Have a good day. With this last point, this actually requires something of them. When you present God as judge, it means that you can't just recognize, yeah, maybe he exists, maybe he doesn't. It means that this has implications for your life. That there has to be a change of life if you're going to accept this God, because he's not just all these other things discussed. He's also the judge, and you're going to have to answer to him one day. And so the Apostle Paul would say he's now calling us all to repent. He's calling us all to change our way of thinking, which then leads to a change of life, and to align ourselves with him once again. God recognized our ignorance in the past. God recognized the fact that we'd gotten off course, but now's the time to get back on track. Now it's time for the human race to get back in line with the God who created them, because one day he's going to judge the world. Well, that's a bold claim, Paul. How can you say he's going to judge the world? Well, he's appointed his son. How do you say he's his son? He raised him from the dead. So you go backwards from that. Jesus risen from the dead proved that he was the Son of God, which then traces back to the God who said he was going to appoint his son as a judge. And therefore that goes back to the God who is ultimately the judge. And so the Apostle Paul gives a really thorough picture of this God. And he presents that to them. In verse 32, now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some began to sneer. Others said, we shall hear you again concerning this. So Paul went out of their midst. But some men joined him and believed, among whom also were Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris and others with them. So you have 3 responses from Paul's message there. You have some who sneer. And that can be a reaction of a lot of people who hear the message. It could be for different reasons. It might be because they just have no concern for God. Or it could be that they're convicted. It might be because they don't have an argument, so they just sneer and make fun of and mock what you're trying to say. It could be for a lot of reasons, but oftentimes you'll find that people just want to sneer and mock, blow it off, and then just want to dismiss what you're saying. Others want to procrastinate and having to respond to what you're saying. They said, we shall hear you again concerning this. And we want to give them a little bit of credit. Maybe it's just because they wanted to hear more information. Maybe they really were genuinely wanting to hear more. But we could also say that maybe they're kind of just putting off really coming to terms with what Paul is saying. And then, of course, some believe. Some joined and believed. Among also were Dionysus and the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris. And we're not told exactly how many believe, but given that just a few people are given, I don't think it'd be too off base to say that there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of people who were converted through this process. Typically, Luke would notate if that happened. Many of the noble women believe, or usually he'll tell you if there's a lot of people being converted. 3,000 were baptized that day or something like that. Here he just mentions a couple of people, which shows that, at the end of the day, could the Apostle Paul lay in his bed and say, well, that was a failure? I went to the marketplace. I stood before the Areopagus, the highest court in philosophy. I proclaimed this God and all these various aspects of this God. I proclaimed him as judge and his son as the one that is going to judge all the world. And only a few people believed. What a failure. I don't think Paul believed that. I don't think Paul believed that whole incident was a failure, that he somehow didn't succeed. He succeeded because he proclaimed the truth. And anytime you proclaim the truth, it's a success. Whether only one person is converted, whether 5 people are converted, or 0 people are converted. Every time we proclaim Jesus Christ, every time we proclaim the God that we serve, we succeeded. We can lay our heads down that night and say, we did what was our duty to do. We proclaimed the God that we serve. We proclaim him to the people that we came into contact with today. And so an elder told me this, an elder from another church told me this one time. He said, you know what? When it comes to preaching the gospel, this is the one thing you'll do in your life where you're not held responsible for the results. Everything else you do, people want results. They want product. They want you to produce something. They want you to produce something of high quality, and they have expectations. When it comes to proclaiming the gospel, you're not responsible for the results. You just teach the truth. If you taught the truth, you were successful. Whether they accept it or not is on them. It's between them and God. You just teach what you know to be true and leave the results to that individual to do, either dismiss it or to accept it. So the Apostle Paul here gives us a wonderful, wonderful message. And I would say, this is a good text to go to. A lot of times this text is used just to talk about apologetics. This is how you should speak to people in the community, and definitely it's valuable for that. And we talked about that some this morning. But I would turn you to that sermon to excite or to intensify your worship of God, because everything in there that the Apostle Paul talked about should draw us closer to God and should bring us to our knees before God in worship. This God who is creator of all things, the God who is of the highest authority above everything, a God who cannot be contained in anything that humans would create, a God who is all-sufficient, a God who is the source of all life, a God who desires a relationship with us, that's a big one, and a God who is very close to us and near to us, and then one who is our Father and one who is ultimately our judge. Every one of those things can draw us into worship of God. Every one of those things should cause us to just be in awe and wonder of this great and wonderful God. Certainly, we could use it for that very purpose. And so, this morning, as we continue our worship service and as we partake of the Lord's Supper and as we're singing songs and as we're praying, remember that the God that we're interacting with is this God portrayed by the Apostle Paul. This is not some arbitrary God. This isn't just some demigod who just is not reliable, not trustworthy, that just follows after his own cares and concerns. This is a God who is all-sufficient in himself and therefore all-sufficient for us. And this is a wonderful and awesome God, and we are very privileged to be able to have a relationship with such a God. And if you're here this morning and you want to answer the invitation, know that God wants you to have a relationship with him. He's not saying, well, I'll offer it to you, but I don't really want it. He wants a relationship with you. He's constructed human history in such a way that you would seek after him and find him. Not just seek after him, but find him. That's what Paul says here in Acts chapter 17. He's seeking for you. He's seeking you as a lost sheep. Come to him. He'll receive you with open arms. It doesn't matter what you've done in the past. It doesn't matter the mistakes that you've made. It doesn't matter how atrocious you dealt with other people, or it doesn't matter what other people think about you, or if they forgive you or don't forgive you. Come to God. His arms are open. He will receive you with loving arms. He's seeking you, and he wants you to find him. Please come to him this morning if you are inclined to do so. And you may do that as you come forward and we stand and sing the song that Dylan has prepared.